And on that note, then, I am very anxious to hear what Paul and Bella have to tell us about exploring the polar regions and their guide's perspective with a focus on the polar bear in and around Hudson Bay. So Bella and Paul, please take over.
We're coming.
Oops, your mic is off.
All right, here we are. As I was saying, you've got to love technology. It's great when it works. And let's hope there are no more issues as we go on tonight. So thank you all so much for tuning in and being here tonight. My name is Bella Waterton, and I grew up here in the Grey Bruce area. And recently, my partner Paul and I have moved back to the area. And when we are here in this area, not guiding, we love to be just relaxing and playing outside. We really like to spend time with our dog, Nally Cho, who is pictured here. And so tonight we're going to talk to you about our time in the travel and tourism industry. Both Paul and I have been working for a number of years, 13 years myself, and that's really allowed us to travel all around the world, which we are really grateful for, and we hope to share some snippets of those travels with you tonight. A few housekeeping items. We are out in rural Kemble, so we have very slow internet. So in hopes that the slideshow goes smooth, we're actually going to turn our video off during most of the presentation. And then we'll pop back on when we do questions at the end. So without further ado, this is Paul Scriver.
Yeah, as Bella said, my name is Paul, and I've been working in the travel and tourism industry for 16 years now. Started very young and came from a very outdoorsy family, and pretty well any excuse to get outside, paddling, kayaking, hiking, biking, anything I jumped at. And that led me to work throughout high school as a guide for a company called Blackfeather, and that was actually how Bella and I met. Was 14 years ago, working as guides up in the Canadian Arctic. So our plan for this evening is to share a couple of stories with you. From our travels, and starting off in the Canadian North, and then moving to the Arctic regions, and then honing back in on Hudson Bay area. And Antarctica, sorry, yes. And throughout, we intend to sort of weave together some stories about a couple of the bits of wildlife and species that we see along our travels, and some of the stories and anecdotes about how things are changing even in the short time that we've been traveling to these regions. So we hope you enjoy it. A couple more bits of housekeeping. If you have a question along the way, feel free to leave it in the Q&A or in the chat. At the end, we'll circle back and we'll try to answer as many questions as we have time for. But hope you enjoy, and we'll get on to it.
Great, so we are going to start in Northern Canada. Primarily, we're going to start talking about Northwest Territories and Yukon, and a bit into Nunavut as well, primarily talking about northern rivers. And that's really where our guiding career started, was up north on these beautiful, beautiful northern rivers. Throughout high school and university, that was our summer job. We would be on 2-week self-sufficient canoe trips, and we would just do those trips kind of back to back all summer long. It really was a dream job, and we're very, very grateful for those opportunities. So we would fly into a small town, be it Fort Simpson or Norman Wells in the Northwest Territory. And then from there, we would take a small bush plane into the beginning of the trip. So typically a small lake where we would fly into. And this is a view from the plane. This is always one of my favorite parts of the trip is the excitement is building as we're flying in with a bunch of people who we don't really know yet, but we're about to spend 14 days with them on the river in the middle of nowhere. And just looking down, flying over the river that we're about to paddle down is really a special, special moment. So this is a small tributary from the Mountain River. It actually has been named Blackfeather Creek by Blackfeather guides, of course, but it's truly an unnamed small tributary that's quite steep, quite narrow, and it has some really fun canyons that make for some challenging whitewater. So again, the plane is now leaving, and that always is just such a feeling of true isolation. You really feel like you're in the middle of absolute nowhere, which of course you are. And you're worrying if you packed day 5 dry food or whatever it is. All of those worries just disappear, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. You have what you have, and you're with who you're with. And the next 14 days have lots of adventure in store. Of course, this is when the hard work begins. So typically we have to portage out of those lakes into the rivers, and you never are really quite sure what you're going to get yourself into. In this case, again, this is the early beginnings of Blackfeather Creek. There's not much water. It takes a while for us to find enough water to actually be able to float in, let alone be able to paddle through. And of course, farther downstream, there is some really big whitewater. And this is what Paul and I love the most about river trips, is the challenging whitewater. Adding in 10 guests who have varying whitewater experience, you're really not quite sure what you're going to get. So teaching and coaching the guests throughout the trip is really fun, and it's really part of the experience. The thing about northern rivers, of course, is that they're continuously flowing. Unlike the rivers you may be familiar with here in southern Ontario, where there's a rapid and then at the bottom there's a pool. We call those pool and drop, but up north they're continuously flowing. So if you are to have a dump to spill out of your canoe, all of your things could keep on flowing all the way out to the Mackenzie River, of course, which is a massive river flowing into the Arctic Ocean. So you're wanting to make sure you have good systems in place to make sure you can get the canoe, let alone the contents of the canoe.
And this is really the character of these rivers, these cobblestone beaches and big open valleys. And the rivers kind of meander and braid as they flow along. Oftentimes these rivers are flowing anywhere from 5 to 12 kilometers an hour as their normal pace. So it's like a little conveyor belt pushing you through the landscape. And so these big open valleys open up, and then you go through another tight canyon or big canyon system. And that's really the look and feel of these trips. Here, Bella is describing our route for the day to this group of guests as they take in, or it actually looks like they're taking in some lunch here. But we can travel anywhere from 20 kilometers to times 80 kilometers on these rivers a day. And this constant, consistent flow is really quite a different experience as we travel along. Here I am making, I think, coffee and probably some bacon for this group. One lazy morning, we got on the river early and just floated along as we had a break for breakfast. That technique of swinging the coffee pot is meant to, it's a cowboy coffee technique, and meant to settle out the grounds with the forces acting on the coffee. It doesn't really work, but it makes for a good show.
And so this is one of our favorite places. This is on the Nahanni River, which is referred to sometimes by people as the Grand Canyon of the North, and for really good reason. It's absolutely stunning. There are huge canyons through this river. And where we're sitting here on the ledge of this waterfall, this is called Virginia Falls. And to give you some perspective, Virginia Falls is double the height of Niagara Falls. So it's absolutely a massive waterfall. For guides, this is a really exciting part of the trip. We all look forward to it. We have typically 2 days here. We need that time to portage around the falls, of course. That's a grueling 2 kilometers, quite steep terrain. And so we take a couple days to do a portage. the Dene of the region, so the local indigenous people who inhabit this area, have named the waterfall Virginia Falls. They've named it Nally Cho, and that, if you may heard, that's actually what we have named our dog after, is this waterfall. And the Nahanni area, the river has been named a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which is really a great thing.
So this is the view from the bottom of the falls looking downstream. And this is where the real whitewater starts on the Nahanni. And so as you're looking down and forging out into this first canyon, which is actually called Fourth Canyon, the canyons were named from the Mackenzie River up to Virginia Falls, because that's the way it was first explored. But you can see the spectacular rock faces of these canyons, and they can be up to 1 kilometer deep on the Nahanni. And I credit this sort of scene with instilling my love of geology, and that's actually what I studied throughout university. I've never worked in the field of geology, but it has landed me a couple of cool gigs. Throughout my schooling, I actually had the opportunity to go down to Antarctica to study glaciology. And it was there that I sort of cemented my love for traveling on board ships. And I kept looking for any excuse to bring me back to the polar regions. And we found a company that needed some guides, and we jumped at the opportunity to start traveling aboard these ships. And we'll start off in the Arctic. And on these expedition cruise ships, they're anywhere from just under 100 passengers to around 200 passengers. And we travel in sort of 3 distinct regions in the Arctic. The first being Svalbard, or the Spitsbergen Archipelago, shown by this red arrow here. And that archipelago is governed by Norway, but hosts all sorts of interesting wildlife and great history. We've also traveled pretty extensively all around Greenland, and predominantly on Western Greenland, and then all throughout the Canadian Arctic as well. All throughout these Arctic islands, around Baffin Island, all throughout the Northwest Passage to Cambridge Bay, and spent quite a number of days in that area. This is a pretty typical scene that we're looking for. And on these ships, we're always in the search for wildlife. So on this vessel, we happened upon a mum bear and 2 cubs feasting on a seal. And obviously, we try to poke in very nice and slowly and get a good view. But this is kind of the tour that we're doing. And there's all sorts of other things to see. Bears are one of the main reasons why people travel to the Arctic, but there's also a plethora of bird life. This is an Arctic tern sitting on a nest, very well camouflaged eggs. Again, another polar bear, and we can see these either from the ship or from zodiacs. And seals are another main target species that we're looking for. And this is a bearded seal that I happened upon with a group of kayakers. And I'll let Bella discuss a little bit about what we do on these ships.
Yeah, so primarily on board the ships, Paul and I took on a variety of different roles, from zodiac driving to general naturalists, but primarily we focused on the adventure options, so kayaking in the Arctic, and then in the Antarctic, there's opportunity to stand up paddleboard, as well as a day program, which is involving of a inflated kayak, so a bit of a different experience. But anyways, here we are with a pretty typical group out in Svalbard. You can see there's lots of ice around to explore, and nice small pieces of ice that we can paddle up to and kind of examine, get close to. We always have a safety zodiac, so you can see the zodiac in the background, just slowly puttering behind us to make sure everything goes okay. But we always have that there just in case. The thing about kayaking in these polar regions is that we're able to have a much more intimate, immersive experience. So, you know, we just have 16 guests. We're able to go into small harbors and coves and really get a different experience than everybody else is getting on the ship. So we're able to have some intimate experiences with wildlife. Of course, we're always looking for polar bears. That's one of our biggest challenges operating in the Arctic regions out of a kayak. But there's something to be said about being the captain of your own vessel.
One of the stories that we wanted to share about, anecdotes about what we've seen in the Arctic is the increase in prevalence of orca sightings. And we've seen this along the way. And orca typically don't range very far or spend too much time up in the high Arctic. And the biggest reason is because of that large, significant dorsal fin that you see there. They aren't really built to be excellent at navigating through sea ice, and sea ice persists throughout the Canadian Arctic year round. And so as things are changing and the climate is warming in the area, sea ice extent is decreasing on a yearly basis. And we're actually seeing an orca going up and far more sightings further into the Arctic narrow waterways, where they haven't been seen by locals, the Inuit, in the past. And so this is one of the experiences that we had, and it was an orca just checking out the ship, investigating us. So really in these areas, the wildlife, they're not really all that accustomed to seeing humans. They will see the odd hunter or the odd community along the way, but for the most part, the wildlife in these remote regions are just as curious about us as we are of them. So it provides some great viewing opportunities when you're having that sort of true interaction. And the last sort of piece of this puzzle is that with the increase of orca traveling through these areas, many of the local whale species that are normally up in this area aren't all that used to having that apex predator trolling the waters. So this is a bowhead whale, and there's been a dramatic increase in sightings of bowheads that have washed up along the shore, and with obvious signs of orca or killer whale predation. And they're also being quite a challenge to narwhal and beluga, some of the smaller whale species in the Arctic as well.
Okay, so we are now heading southbound down to the Southern Ocean, and we're going to talk about Antarctica and the sub-Antarctic islands for a little bit here. So as you may know, and I believe that many of you have traveled down to Antarctica, so some of these images you may know about, but from typically these trips leave from the southern tip of Argentina, a small town called Ushuaia. And a typical Antarctic trip is about 10 days in length. Of course, there's lots of different options, but it does take a while to actually get down to the Antarctic. So it takes 2 days typically to cross the Drake Passage. You may have heard of it. It is known to be one of the roughest patches of ocean in the world, and it truly can be an experience crossing the Drake. You can have the shaky Drake, or the Drake shake, as we call it sometimes, pictured here, where you get the waves coming up over the bow. It certainly is an experience, and you definitely figure out quickly if you are seasick or not. But you can also sometimes have a beautiful option, which is Drake Lake. And that's a really lucky option for those of you who may have experienced that. Good for you. But back to kind of some different trip options. For those of you who may want a bit more of an adventurous option, maybe the more wildlife-focused traveler would choose voyages that include the Falkland Islands and South Georgia. So these are sub-Antarctic islands, and you may have heard of South Georgia, which is the star of many nature documentaries, and it truly is a wildlife mecca. And so one of the really positive news stories that is coming out of South Georgia is the South Georgia Pippet. And it's really well camouflaged here. I have some arrows to point out so you can, just in case you can't see it, there we go. So the South Georgia Pippet is a positive news story for a few different reasons. With first contact that happened in South Georgia a long time ago in the 17th century with Captain Cook, that was one of the first ships to bring rats to this island as stowaways. And so, of course, as you know, rats are hugely devastating to bird populations. And so this Pippet has really had a hard time. An organization formed out of South Georgia called the South Georgia Heritage Trust, and it began a lengthy process to completely eradicate all of the rats off of the island. It took quite a long time, but as of 2018, South Georgia has been declared as completely rat-free. Largely, this is thanks to tourism and to tourists and their donations. When Paul and I first started going down here to South Georgia about 10 years ago, it was quite rare to see a Pippet. We would often send the ornithologists ashore first to try to scout, one, maybe two out if they could, and then we would kind of slowly bring in small groups of passengers to get a fleeting glance. In our most recent visit in 2019, Pippets were everywhere. You would get to any landing site and you would see tons of Pippets all around. Every single person who wanted to see a Pippet was seeing one, if not many more. So a really positive news story that is coming out of South Georgia.
So as we mentioned, South Georgia really is known as a wildlife mecca, but there is just a bonanza on shore of wildlife. King penguins, as you see here, there's a number of very large colonies. There's also all sorts of different seabirds that are nesting along the cliffs that you can see in the background. And as well on shore, there's tons and tons of fur seals and southern elephant seals, which are about twice as big as the kind that you may have seen in the US. These elephant seals will haul out on shore, and in November, when is their mating and pupping season, they are quite boisterous on the shore, the big males fighting. But just to talk about the king penguins briefly here, this is a site called St. Andrews Bay, and there's approximately 300,000 breeding pairs on this site. So, anywhere around 700,000 penguins call this site home. It can be quite loud and quite smelly, but one of the interesting stories happening in this area is that South Georgia is seeing some dramatic effects of climate change, as with all the parts of this region. The Southern Ocean is warming, and as that's happening, South Georgia is glaciated, and this is having a huge effect on the glaciers, causing some dramatic retreat. And one of the interesting stories here is that this is actually increasing the size of this glacial retreat, is increasing the size of this colony, this rookery, because it's opening up more space for the colony to expand into. So as this is the same spot, but looking back at the glacier, as the glacier retreats, this meltwater stream is continuously flowing out, and the penguins are expanding into this range. So I don't have a current estimate of the population size, and that's largely because of the lack of research that happened in the last couple of years, but Bella will talk about that later. But one of the reasons why the penguins frequent this meltwater stream is they're actually undergoing a molt, these individuals here, and they like to have freshwater access to drink and to preen while they're going through this energy intensive state. So it's really kind of a weird story. Possibly good for this particular colony is it's expanding, but really what's going to happen long term with the change in the climate around South Georgia is quite uncertain for these penguins. Here's another image just to illustrate the amount of retreat that's happening in the area. On this top image from 1972, you can see this little small bit of rock cliff exposed in the center of the image. And from the exact same angle in 2014, you can see that there's been a dramatic retreat of the glacier. It's actually retreated around 2 kilometers, just to give you a sense of scale. And from our travels, this site is called Gold Harbor, and it's quite a popular site to visit. But in our last visit in 2019, this glacial tongue here was all but disappeared. So quite a dramatic amount of change happening. And, you know, it's apparent even in the short time that that we've been traveling, and that tourism has been active in Antarctica and these sub-Antarctic islands. In this image, you can see Bella kayaking away with her group of paddlers. But really, we want to talk about the tussock grass, the grass in the foreground. And that is the nesting site for many of these seabirds that call South Georgia home. So the tussock grass is the host for many species of albatross, prions, and all sorts of other seabirds. But we're lucky enough to be able to go up and check out this particular rookery or nesting site on Prion Island. And it's only open at particular times of the year, but the main event here is to be able to see wandering albatross nesting sites. So that's a wandering albatross behind us. And they have a 12-foot wingspan, and they're a very long-lived bird, about 50 years sort of average lifespan. And one of the other interesting stories that's happening, and good news stories in the area, is that many of these albatross species are doing quite well. And in addition to the rat eradication, another reason for this rebound is because there's been some dramatic changes in regulations surrounding longline fishing. So fishing vessels pulling long fishing lines with lures attached to them. And in the past, albatross have dove for these lures and been caught as bycatch. But with some change to that fishing strategy and the regulations about where and when they can fish and the types of lures they can use, there's been a dramatic reduction in the amount of bycatch of albatross. So it's another good story. And again, with this long-lived bird, they mate for life as well. So, you know, there's some heartbreaking scenes of albatross waiting around for their mate to come back to help feed the chick. This is from the same site, Prion Island, and we were lucky enough to see this wandering albatross chick just stretching his wings and trying to gain some muscle tone and definition, just practicing on this windy day. But again, it's a matter of these birds and many of the species in this area are not used to any sort of land predators. So they're very relaxed and comfortable with activity being quite close to them in this setting.
Okay, great. So we are now going to finally get to the icy continent, Antarctica, which is actually the coldest, windiest, highest, and driest continent on Earth. We had a pretty nice day here, pictured here. Winds were calm, if nothing at all, and we had a beautiful kayak through the ice. But of course, wildlife is a big draw for people as well when they're down in the Antarctic. So you can see here on this piece of ice is a leopard seal just lazing about. So leopard seals, you know, you may have seen photos of them specifically maybe from the wildlife photographer Paul Nicklin, or if you've watched any nature documentaries about this area, you've surely seen them. But they are one of the top predators down in the Antarctic, and they primarily feed on penguins. So depending on the time of year, they're, you know, more or less active depending on the feeding times. And the leopard seals are the second only to orca in terms of the top predator in Antarctica. And of course, big ice is a big draw for many passengers coming down to the Antarctic. The Antarctic continent holds 90% of the world's ice. And with this photo, we are getting a bit of lens compression. Paul and I are actually in this photo, again, kayaking. but we are much farther away than it appears to you on your screen right now. These landscapes are truly immense. Everything is huge, and it can be really challenging to judge distances, as there aren't any buildings or trees or anything that we're able to judge for scale. Of course, icebergs and glaciers can be very dangerous. They can roll and collapse. And as you know, we only see the tips of icebergs, actually just 1/10 of them. So we really do take our time and a lot of caution around these big, massive pieces of ice.
Another one of the things of particular interest down in Antarctica are penguins again. And just some interesting stories happening with the penguins in this region. But we do get to go to shore along the Antarctic Peninsula and get to interact with penguins. There are quite a few regulations governing what we can do and how we do it. But largely the penguins don't know the rules. So we have to stay 5 meters away from all wildlife and more from some particular species. But if you're quiet and calm, again, they don't really have land predators. So if you sit down on the beach and just wait and see what happens, penguins have been known to come up and peck at your boots, and the odd one has jumped into a lap or two. But I would challenge any one of you to watch a penguin waddle by and not have a smile on your face. They're incredibly graceful when they're swimming and porpoising in the water. But on land, the only way to describe them is just goofy. So the penguin that you see in this picture is the Gentoo penguin, one of the brush-tail species that we have on the peninsula, one of the 3 small penguins down there. And these Gentoo penguins are one of the sort of good news stories of the area as well, or at least I should say, for the time being, are benefiting from some of the changes happening. So along the Antarctic Peninsula, it's quite a bit less insulated from the Arctic Ocean, the Southern Ocean, I should say, than the continent itself. So as the climate is warming and the Southern Ocean is warming, things are happening and changing quite a bit faster along the peninsula. There's an increase in precipitation falling as rain, and an increase in the amount of melt that's happening on a season-to-season basis. The Gentoos are actually able to sort of capitalize on this as there's more rock being exposed, and they like these rocky sites to make their rookeries, to make their nests. So they're taking advantage of the changes, for the time being, expanding their population as a whole, and the Antarctic is increasing. But that is not the same for all the species along the peninsula. In this image, you can see an Adelie penguin. And the Adelies are known as the only true Antarctic penguin. They're the only species that will stay around Antarctica year-round and feed around the margin of the sea ice. The rest of the species will go out into the Southern Ocean, out into open water to feed on krill throughout the Antarctic winter. The Adelies aren't doing so well. They have a slightly different nesting strategy than the Gentoos, and they prefer spots that are nice and dry and high, out of the way of any rainfall or meltwater happening. And so with this warming climate, they aren't doing quite as well, and there's actually been some significant collapse of some of the colonies along the peninsula. There are still quite a number of very large Adelie penguin colonies, but they are definitely on the decline and being pushed out of some of their classic rookery sites by Gentoo penguins. So they're not doing as well. Here's one that just jumped into the kayak support Zodiac, much to my surprise. I almost went jumping out the other side before I realized it was a penguin. But yeah, another interesting story developing.
All right, so here we are back to the adventure options. So you can actually see this is Paul here, and these are some of his guests out with him stand-up paddleboarding. Believe it or not, we have people who come to Antarctica and stand-up paddleboard for the first time ever. Pretty unique and crazy place to learn how to sup for the first time, but we get it all the time. So they're obviously taking a break and taking in this extremely amazing moment happening in front of them. Humpback whales coming to check them out. So another positive news story out of Antarctica is the drastic rebound in whale populations that we're seeing. As you may know, whaling devastated many species, and by the late 18th century, it was a full-blown industry. Sadly, by the 1930s, it was thought that approximately 80% of all whale species were on the verge of extinction in and around the Southern Ocean. In the late 80s, a group called the International Whaling Commission formed, and they voted to enact a whaling moratorium. And that is still in effect today, and it's voted on annually. In the mid-90s, a Southern Ocean Whale Sanctuary was formed, which includes 50 million square kilometers in and around the Antarctic waters, and it strives to protect those waters and, of course, the cetaceans that live in them. So while whaling was a hugely impactful on many species, we're seeing a few come back in large numbers, specifically humpback whales. Again, the first time that Paul and I went down to the Antarctic, it was pretty unique to see a spotting of a humpback whale, you know, maybe a couple on one voyage if you were lucky. But compared to 2019, our last time in the Antarctic, it was completely different. You know, there were humpback whales absolutely everywhere.
As Bella said, like it's almost to the extent where we would go on a Zodiac cruise or try to go to land, and you physically couldn't go anywhere because there were so many whales around the ship. We're talking hundreds of whales at times. And also we saw a dramatic increase in very large feeding events where we'd see many different species of whales, including orca or killer whales, fin whales, minkies, and humpback whales, all feeding on the same krill amalgamation. It's always very spectacular events to see. And I wouldn't be exaggerating to say 500 to 1,000 whales in view from these large feeding events. And one of the other big increases that we've seen is the amount of sightings of orca or killer whales down in the Antarctic as well. There's a couple of different ecotypes or subspecies that frequent the Antarctic waters, but they would be very rare to see. In the start of my time down in Antarctica, it was, you know, kind of typical to see 2 or 3 sightings throughout the fleet of orca over the course of the season. And now it's not uncommon to see on each departure 2 or 3 sightings of a pod or different pods of orca swimming and transiting through some of the open waterways or hunting, and even interacting with zodiacs and hunting in front of zodiacs out on cruises. So it's a really interesting increase. And one of the things that we find the most striking about this increase is also that we're seeing so many more of these whales. And the reason we find this so striking is that due to the lifespan of whales, I mean, if you take humpbacks as an example, they can live around 50 to 60 years quite easily. So many of them would have been alive during the whaling days and should have a strong fear of human activity in ships. But even nonetheless, they're curious and they're willing to interact with humans. And, you know, whales also have been proven to have strong memory and oral tradition, being able to pass stories between generations. So we find it really impressive, and it just makes it all that much more amazing to have these experiences with whales coming and checking us out and interacting with us.
Yes. Yes.
So this is, it's funny to say, but this is quite a typical normal experience with whales these days. And as you can see, they're quite comfortable interacting with us, and they're just checking us out, cruising by. One of the things that we kind of find challenging with the cruise industry as a whole is that it's quite a carbon intensive industry. So we have to balance that out somehow. You know, we're sitting on a ship that's burning around 19 tons of fuel a day. And really what we have to fall back on is that our only hope is that we're creating polar ambassadors and supporting positive change by capturing the hearts and minds of the visitors that we bring to these regions. And hopefully they take that passion home and make change in their own lives, or try to make changes with their communities.
All right, so switching places again, we are going to head northbound again, and we're gonna stay here for the remaining time of our presentation. We're gonna focus in and around the Hudson Bay area, specifically talking about Churchill. So you may have heard of Churchill. I'm sure many of you have actually been up to Churchill, and hopefully you've had some good interactions of polar bears. Of course, Churchill is the self-proclaimed polar bear capital of the world, and for good reason. There are lots of polar bears in Churchill at certain times of the year, and tundra buggies, these massive buses essentially that you're seeing on your screen now, those are kind of the main and typical way to go and see polar bears. These buses are capable of driving over really rough terrain in lots of different seasons, and they can bring quite a few tourists out at a time to go and have some close interactions with bears. So this is how many people see polar bears. Again, I'm sure many of you in the audience have had this exact experience, and it allows guests to go out for a day or two to view polar bears up close. Paul and I have always really loved bears, specifically polar bears, and it's always been a dream of ours to get up north to Churchill specifically to kind of have some, to have an experience with polar bears. So we were lucky to get in with a company called Churchill Wild, and Churchill Wild owns and operates a few lodges along the Hudson Bay coast. And what they offer is really unique, and likely one of the only companies in the world which offers walking tours with polar bears. So we literally are on the ground with bears every day, taking guests out in hopes of finding a situation exactly like this one. A lot of guests joke that we're not actually walking. We do a lot of standing with bears, and it's a fair point. The reason that happens, of course, is because we're seeing polar bears during the summer and the fall seasons when they're off of the ice, and this is their time to relax. They're trying to conserve as much energy as they can, so they're not doing much walking. So there is actually a bear in this photo. And again, this is pretty typical. We try to position ourselves into places where we think we're gonna have the best encounter possible with a bear. So in this case, we spotted a mom and cub very far off in the distance. I'm trying to use my pointer here, circling a small white dot in the distance. And that is in fact what we are looking for and what we're waiting for here. So oftentimes we will use vehicles to get a little bit further afield, and that allows us, of course, to have more experiences, but we're always getting out of the vehicles and viewing bears from the ground. That's the safest, best option. Oftentimes, as guides, we are listening to the sound of camera shutters going off in rapid succession. As you can see here, there are lots of avid photographers. And you know, that's really a big draw for a lot of our guests is photography. Being able to get that shot on the ground, having that bear walking towards you is really unique and something that the tundra buggy option doesn't allow. So you can see this is Paul here and this is me in the background. We're standing in the back. We're not concerned This bear was obviously relaxed, or looks like it's far off still. There are some big lenses there. So we're not super concerned. If we were, we would be out in front of the guest and we'd be managing the encounter, really dealing with the bear.
So this video shows what is a pretty typical way of seeing a bear. It's just trudging along. We've placed ourselves in a good spot so that we have a nice view as the bear comes along. But this female really knew where she was going. And following her nose north along the coast, she's keenly aware of our presence, but just keeping her space and going about her business, doing bear stuff. So why have bears congregated in this area along the Churchill coast? Why is it known as the polar bear capital of the world? Hudson Bay is relatively unique insofar as that it's a very large area that completely thaws and completely freezes over with sea ice on a yearly basis. Obviously, that means that when the bay is ice-free, the bears get relegated to shore, forced to shore, and they slowly plod around, moving slowly back towards the place where they think the ice is going to come back first. And that's the reason why bears congregate in the Churchill area and further south along the coast. So up here, you see the Seal River Heritage Lodge, which is one of our lodges, and it's about 75 kilometers north of Churchill. Diamond Lake is another one that we operate just in the October-November season. And Nanook is the lodge that Belle and I have spent a lot of time at as well, and it's about 250 kilometers south of Churchill. So as the bay starts to freeze and things get colder, one of the main reasons and things that sort of seeds or starts the freezing of the ice are the freshwater rivers coming in and flowing onto the surface of the bay. So around York Factory down here, there's the Hayes and the Nelson rivers that input a large amount of fresh water onto the bay. And around Churchill, there's the Churchill River. So that really does start an early freeze. And that's why one of the reasons why bears congregate in this area. Another reason is that there's this counterclockwise current that flows around and around and around in Hudson Bay. And that pushes all the ice that forms up along this coastline down, and it catches up on Cape Churchill. And again, it also catches up on Cape Tatnam, which is the coast that Nanook sits on. And so these two sort of angular bits of coastline are a real cause for early ice to form, and the bears know that. They're habitual. They will return to the same sites year after year and patiently twiddle their paws as they wait for the ice to form.
So how do our guests get into the lodges? So typically, guests will fly from Winnipeg to Churchill on a scheduled flight. When they arrive in Churchill, weather dependent, they will then get on one of these small passenger planes, which hold 9 passengers, and they'll fly into the lodges. Again, weather dependent. Weather, of course, is the ultimate dictator up in the north. Everything revolves around the weather, and weather changes plans in an instant. As a lodge manager, I typically have multiple plans going on changeover days because truly things change so quickly. So Paul talked a bit about the lodges. The most northern lodge, Seal River, it's about a 20 to 30 minute flight from Churchill. And then the most southern lodge, Nanook, it can be about an hour and a half flight, depending on the winds, of course. So this is Nanook Lodge pictured here. And the lodges are really well appointed. There are 8 guest rooms to hold 16 guests. So that's our maximum number. And then there's a shared dining area as well as a shared kind of lounge and living area. All of the lodges have a fence that goes completely around the lodge in an area kind of close to the lodge we call our compound. And we like to joke that these fences are bear resistant, not bear proof. When our guests get off of the plane, of course, they're greeted by the guides, and the guides talk to them about bear safety, give them a briefing. And one of the main rules at the lodge is that you are never to leave the fence without a guide. We like to say that as humans, we're in the zoo and the bears are looking in at us, which is a really nice contrast. And this is a really great way for us to view bears closer than we typically would. So this mom and 2 cubs had a nice walk by, and guests are able to kind of go out into the compound. Of course, the guides are always out there with them. Again, bear resistant, not bear proof. And it just allows people to have a closer, intimate experience with bears, as well as get some really great shots, photos. So it's not just about bears, of course, that is the main attraction for many of our guests, but this is Seal River Lodge pictured here. And as you can see, it's situated directly on the coastline of Hudson Bay. There's a perfect little natural harbor that has formed here as well, so that allows us to use zodiacs and to get out onto Hudson Bay. The main reason that we get out in the zodiacs and go onto the bay is to view beluga whales. So beluga whales come into Hudson Bay every summer when the ice is gone. We get about 75,000 individuals coming into the bay each year. And they come in for 3 different reasons. The first one being to molt in the warm freshwater rivers. So they go through a catastrophic molt every summer, and they like to get up into the warm freshwater rivers. Secondly, they're coming in to feed primarily on capelin, which are really small, tiny little fish. And thirdly, they're coming in to calve. And here actually is a video of a newborn baby beluga that was just born minutes before the zodiac showed up.
So with this encounter, we were quite literally witnessing the first few breaths that this beluga was taking. And we noticed this pause they came towards us, and the adults were gently nudging the calf towards us, almost proud, showing off that what they knew. And 5 minutes or so later, the calf took its first few strokes with its tail, and they all swam off. But it was a really powerful experience.
And so, of course, it's not just about the bears, not just about the belugas. There are lots of other amazing wildlife encounters to be had. Specifically, lots of shorebirds frequent the Hudson Bay coast as they migrate through. And pictured here, we have the Hudsonian godwit, which is a really interesting and quite a rare species to see. Here you can see all of these white little specks here are snow geese. So we are seeing huge numbers of snow geese migrating through in the fall, like flocks of hundreds of birds coming through, and it makes for some really beautiful photos in the fall, kind of with the contrast of the colors. So as well, Nanook, as we have talked about, it's quite far south, and it actually is just within the boreal forest. So that allows us to have a bit more of diversity of wildlife. So we do get wolves all along, you can see wolves all along the Hudson Bay coast, but they tend to like the area around Nanook. And so we have had quite a few different wolf packs kind of frequent the area. And one very, very rainy morning, actually it was raining so hard, the guests got stuck at the lodge for 3 additional days because of the crazy storm coming through. So a bad day was made a lot better with this wolf who came to give us a visit in the morning. I don't know about you folks, but our dog Nally often howls back at that video. He didn't this time, but anyone with dogs at home, maybe you had some howls out of your animals there. So again, down in Nunuk within the boreal forest, we're actually able to see black bears as well as polar bears, which is quite unique to have the two species interacting. They don't do much in terms of interaction. As soon as they see each other, they are completely terrified and they both turn around and run in the opposite direction. So we're able to see moose again all along the coast at all three lodges, but primarily at Nunuk, we're seeing lots of moose, especially in the fall season as they get into the fall rut. And in the winter, of course, sometimes we have slow bear days or no bear days. That's not often, but it can happen. And we really rely on the smaller animals on those days. So here pictured, we have willow ptarmigan, and they can make for some really beautiful shots as well. Some years, not always, becoming less frequent, but some years we do actually get to witness the caribou migration coming through. Typically at Seal River Lodge, they're migrating down to the Churchill area. This was back in 2017. We had the herd came through for about almost 2 weeks, and it was really, really quite special to see these animals up close. Of course, back to the little ones, Arctic fox are super fun to watch. And sometimes we will see wolverines. Of course, we can see them all along the coast. This is at Seal River. And you can see there's a carcass here in the background. That is a caribou carcass. We believe it was taken down by wolves. Of course, the wolves follow the herds, as I'm sure all of you know. And this wolverine was doing all that it could to fight off the Arctic foxes in this area. And one of the really amazing things that we have up at the lodges and along the coast of Hudson Bay is Aurora Borealis, the northern lights. So as soon as it's dark in the night, so mid-August through to the end of our season, end of November, if we have clear skies, we're pretty much guaranteed to have some really great aurora. And that's because Hudson Bay is actually situated right below the aurora oval. So we're in really good position to see the lights.
So moving back to bears a little bit here, just briefly talk about their distribution around the Arctic. So starting off in Alaska, there is a strong population there. And in this diagram, we see the faint pink outline is everywhere that you may be able to spot a bear, but the darker pink is their highest concentrations. So Alaska has a strong bear population in the US. All throughout Russia, Severnaya Zemlya, Novaya Zemlya are great places to see bears. Again, Svalbard, we talked about the Norwegian, the islands off the north of Norway, or the Spitsbergen archipelago. In Greenland, we have quite a number of bears, but they're mostly concentrated along the east and north coast of Greenland. Around the southern tip and around the western Greenland coast, due to hunting and the killings for defense of life and property, they've been all but eradicated in that area. Then moving into Canada, Canada holds 2/3 of the global population of polar bears, all throughout as far down as Labrador, but all throughout the Hudson Bay and in throughout the Arctic islands is where we get the highest concentration of bears. But we're going to focus in on Hudson Bay again. And in Hudson Bay, there are basically two populations that are sort of thought to be distinct and unique. So there are 19 subpopulations of polar bears that exist globally, and it's thought that bears don't move between these geographical zones. Again, they're habitual. They like to stay in the places and the hunting spots that they know. So the Western Hudson Bay population of bears has around about 800 to 900 individuals, and the Southern Hudson Bay is thought to be somewhere around 500 or so. And the reason that we have a little bit of certainty with these numbers is that the Hudson Bay bears are the best studied bears in the world. And that's largely because they do get forced ashore on a yearly basis. And it means that they're easily accessible from, let's call it, southern Canada. So we can go up and do mark recapture studies or just physically fly around and count them along the coastline. In terms of the global population, it's kind of a question mark. I want to draw your attention to these brown borders around the some of the 19 subpopulations. And that's largely because that brown color means that they're data deficient, or the population is uncertain. And so there's pretty good estimates of the amount of bears in these regions, but really we don't know strongly and with any sort of certainty what the numbers are. The global population is thought to be between 25 and 30,000 individuals, but there's a lot of discussion and debate around those numbers because there's so much that's just being estimated in that population.
So I'm going to take some time here to go through a year in the life of a polar bear. I'm going to keep it quite basic. I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but as Paul was mentioning, Western Hudson Bay, the population we're focusing on is really unique for a few different reasons. Of course, as he said, the first one being that it is the most studied population. So a lot of the polar bear science that's out there is based on this population. And the second one being that the females in this population, they make their dens to have their cubs, their offspring, make their dens in earthen dens. So they're actually going quite far inland and they're using peat moss to make their dens. This is quite unique. Most other polar bear subpopulations are denning in the ice, in the snow. Some populations, like in Svalbard, for example, the mothers and females will go up into the mountains and use couloirs where there's huge snowpack to make their dens. So that's another kind of really unique fact about the Hudson Bay polar bears. And of course, that they are the only population, or one of, that is forced ashore fully during the summer months. So in the summer, what these bears are doing, as you can see here, this is a mom and two cubs, they're relaxing. They're completely chilling out, trying to conserve as much energy as they can. They're opportunistic eaters and omnivores. So they will feed on grasses and seaweed, and they will ferociously feed on berries when they get the chance. This area, Hudson Bay, Seal River, and Inuk, we have excellent berry crops there. We do a lot of picking of the berries, and we actually do a lot of canning and serve those jams in the lodges. But we have to kind of balance out what we can pick and what we let the bears pick, because the bears will completely demolish an entire patch in a few hours, when that would take us many days to pick. So again, this is a pretty cute photo of a young cub playing around, has a piece of fireweed in its mouth, and this is such a great photo, one of my favorites. Paul took this photo. And so as we get into fall, of course, fall brings colder temperatures. Quite early in October, up there, we're getting below 0 temperatures, and this signals to the bears that it's almost time to head back to the ice. So as Paul mentioned, they will congregate along the shoreline waiting. They'll go back to their spot and they will wait there for the ice to freeze. The cold really invigorates the bears. They will move around a lot more, and we tend to see a lot more curious behavior as the temperatures drop from the bears. In the fall, bears will play fight, or spar, as it's known. This is for fun, but it's also acting as practice for males when they will need to spar to compete for females during mating season in the spring. So being able to see this behavior in the fall around Churchill is quite a unique experience. And you can see the bear on the left there has some significant scarring above its eye. So that tells us it's an older male bear. So this chart here really talks about bears' most productive feeding times. So many think that as soon as the bears get back onto the ice, they're good to go in terms of having lots of seals and having lots of food to eat. Sadly, that's not true. As you can see, the yellow arrow is indicating the winter months, January through March. And these winter months are really harsh for the bears. There's not much food. They're only getting 1 month worth of food within those 3 months. Moving into spring, so the bright pink quadrant here, spring is their most productive time of year for feeding. So as you can see, Here, they're getting 2/3 of their yearly food, kind of March, April through to June. So they're getting 8 months worth of food in essentially 4 months of actual time. So this is a really productive time for the bears. Spring on the ice coincides with seal pupping season. The females birth their young, the female seals will birth their young in layers on the ice, and that acts as a really easy snack for a polar bear. Older seasoned bears know that the most efficient way to gain fat is to eat the outer layer, so the blubber layer, and they will leave the rest. So you'll know a healthy, older, mature bear who has learned this behavior over time will hunt a seal and it will just eat the blubber and it will leave the remains for scavengers. So foxes, birds, they'll follow these bears all the time and they'll eat the remains, the leftovers. So the bears will feed ferociously as much as they can until the ice melts, and at that time they're literally forced ashore because their hunting platform is gone. And then again, they begin their wait during the summer months for the ice to freeze up again in the fall.
So to talk a little bit about the freeze and thaw cycle, just wanted to play this animation for you because it illustrates the cycle quite well. So obviously it's a very large area that pan in kind of puts it into context. But to talk a little bit about the history of the ice and how things are changing, about 50 years ago or more, the day that the bay would freeze would be around October 1st. And then it would stay frozen all the way through to late August, where it would start to break up and the last ice would be off by late August. So that would leave, only 2 months of the year with the bay ice-free where the bears would be forced ashore. The seasonal average for the last 20 years leaves us at approximately mid-July when the last pans of ice would be thawing. And around November 20th was the day where there'd be enough ice for the bears to get off and onto it and do their first bit of hunting, even though, as Bella said, it's not that productive in the fall. About 5 years ago, that trend of decreasing extent of sea ice was continuing, and it was early July when the ice broke up and there was ice free in Hudson Bay, and it was only late December when the ice started to return. So obviously that's a significant change, at least 2 months different on average. An additional 2 months that the bears are being forced ashore and forced to fast. Interestingly, the last 3 years have broken that trend, and there's actually been an early freeze and a late thaw happening on the bay. Our first year up there was 2017, and the bay started to freeze around November 1st. There was enough ice for the bears to be off and hunting. It made for a challenging bear viewing season when the bears were gone. But great year to be a bear. And for the last few years, culminating in 2019, there was a very late breakup too, a late thaw. 2019, there was a bear with a radio collar or an ear tag that was being tracked, and it had the bear coming off the ice on August 24th. And there's satellite imagery showing late ice in throughout the end of August covering the bay. So really great year to be a bear, and whether that is a long-term trend, this sort of local variation, we'll have to wait and see. But more than likely, these last 3 years were just an outlier where the ice is just came back a little bit. It's just a blip, came back early.
So going along the same thread of changes, bears appear to be changing as well. We have witnessed a new behavior where polar bears are hunting and successfully, I may add, beluga whales at the mouths of rivers. So guides first started seeing this behavior about 15 years ago, and in the last 5, it has really evolved and become quite predictable and consistent. So this bear sitting here on this rock has figured out that if he or she, this is a male, but of course, females can do this too. If he or she waits on this rock, the tide will rise, bringing with it beluga whales. And they are in search of the warm, fresh water, trying to get up as far as they can into the river mouth. So this bear It's going to go out on the rock kind of low or mid tide, and it's going to practice patience. It's going to sit here until the tide comes in, so much so that he is literally barely hanging on to much rock at all. Water's lapping up at his paws, I'm sure. And this bear's literally just going to wait and is looking for beluga whales swimming around him. So it's looking for the perfect beluga to swim by so the bear can try its luck at jumping in after the beluga and wrangling this huge animal, which can weigh upwards of 2,000 pounds. So of course, belugas are much better swimmers than the bears are. Bears are great swimmers, but belugas are definitely superior when it comes to swimming than bears. So the bears do a lot of wading and they do a lot of jumping. But they are successful, and successful hunts have been documented. So this photo here shows 6 bears. We have 1, 2, 3. This is Mama with a little baby cub on her back right here. And then this is number 5, and this is number 6 over here. So this is a pretty impressive photo. You can see Mama here. This is the beluga carcass kind of right here. You can just see a bit of it floating up. And Mama is telling off that other bear it's her time to feed, and she's trying to get some food for herself and her cub. In reality, this scene actually had 18 different bears feeding. So back when this behavior was first witnessed, it tended to be a trio of older male bears, and they were nicknamed the 3 amigos. But since then, a wide range of bears have learned this hunting technique. And a kind of really unique behavior was documented in the summer of 2019, where cooperative hunting was witnessed. This hasn't been widely recognized as a behavior that polar bears partake in. However, 2 male bears were seen hunting together, taking down a beluga. So the bears will try to get every last bit that they can. And in turns, that means we're seeing very healthy bears right through into the fall season, where they typically are lean and hungry. So this behavior that I've just kind of talked you through, as unique as it is, it's really just been witnessed by a few kind of different groups of people: guides, guests, lucky guests who maybe luck out on their trip and get to see this behavior, and lots of film crews. So the film crews have kind of figured that this is happening, and they will come up to the lodge. They'll hire their own private guide for, a month or even longer at a time. And they have really long, grueling days. They'll go out whenever the tide allows. They'll go out for the entire time, and they'll literally just sit and watch and wait. And they'll take so much footage, like so many hours of bears jumping. And every now and again, they'll get a successful hunt, which is of course what they're looking for. So a few different film crews: BBC, National Geographic, Planet Earth. CBC did have a segment that showed this behavior a few years ago. If you're interested to look it up, it's quite cool to see. The interesting part of this, however, is all of these people have seen it, but we're not aware of any scientists coming up and, witnessing this behavior, spending time documenting it. So this really significant change has happened. And, anecdotally, we can talk about it, guests talk about it. It's out there in lots of nature documentaries. But as far as we know, no scientists are really talking about it.
So often this really begs the question of what is going to happen to these bears long term. And bears are quite intelligent, they're curious, and they're very adaptive. But we see this behavior of this beluga predation. And there's also some stories around of bears in Labrador hunting char, not quite like grizzly bears do at waterfalls, but literally wading out into the middle of a stream and just pretending they're a rock until fish swim by. But it's an interesting question about whether bears will be able to adapt fast enough as to meet the changes that are happening in the climate. Based on current modeling, yearly sea ice in the region of the Hudson Bay will disappear between 20 and 160 years. And that range is based on which model you subscribe to, the 20 being pretty pessimistic in my view. And the 160 is a kind of a rosy future where we all meet climate targets and politicians kind of get off their rear ends a little bit. But there's a couple of things that add to this, unknown factor of what really is going to happen to these bears in the future. We know so little about their population numbers, that rough estimate of 25 to 30,000 individuals globally. We know very little about their behaviors just because they're so hard to study and observe. And we don't know whether bears really do move between these geographical areas that we've assigned them to. So we don't know, as the ice changes, whether the bears will follow the ice margin north, or what really will happen to them as we go. So it's anybody's guess. In my opinion, the bears of the Hudson Bay area will likely hybridize back into being grizzly bears that have a blondish color, and they'll be kind of hanging out along the shoreline. But we'll have to wait and see, and hopefully there are some breakthroughs in research to help shed light on what the future has in store for polar bears.
So as we've talked about, research is really, really important in all of these places that we get to. And of course, tourism, as we all know, and research and science is on hold due to COVID-19. As you know, it's had profound effects on everyone in everyday life. Tourism ground to a sudden halt, essentially overnight last March. We do see the benefits of tourism in a lot of our work, be it with citizen science, donations to organizations studying wildlife or otherwise. As I mentioned, the South Georgia Pippet is an excellent example of that. Currently, right now, there are likely no or very few ships sailing in Antarctica, which is January. This is the height of the Antarctic season. It's summer down there. It's usually the busiest time to be down in Antarctica. But that means scientists aren't able to catch a ride down to continue with their decades-long penguin, whale, oceanic, glacial, or other research that's happening. And the same has happened in Churchill. Many of the bears in this area of Hudson Bay are studied year to year, and this summer and fall was the first time in decades that this research wasn't able to happen to the extent that it has in the past. So while we're all still grappling with COVID, the lack of scientific collection from these areas will have a lasting effect on our ongoing knowledge of these incredible animals.
So thank you for listening. And just in case anybody thinks this is all fun and games, this guiding gig, and going to go out and get your guiding license, occasionally there's some hard work involved and some manual labor. We'll just show this last video here, and then we'll take some questions.
Splitting woods at Churchill Wild, polar bear. Locals coming by, say hello. Not even helping.
All right, so we hope that everyone was able to see our videos okay. Of course, again, we're dealing with Kemble internet here, so it's not great. We see that there are some questions in the Q&A, so we're gonna pull those up here. We'll hop back onto video now, and we will answer some of these questions. There's a lot, so just give us a sec to read these, and we will give you some answers.
There's a question from Barbara, and is there an Inuit term and word for orca whales? Not to my knowledge. That's a great question. It actually wouldn't surprise me if there wasn't one, but I suspect there is. It's not known to me.
If anybody knows, of course, we know lots of you have traveled all around the world, polar regions as well. And of course, we know that Peter Middleton, I'm not sure if he's listening in tonight, but of course, he has been guiding in the polar regions for longer than we've been alive. And maybe he might have some insight into that as well.
And just gonna skip down to another question from Barbara here too, asking about beluga whales and whether they're being affected by orca migration north or the changes in their distribution. That might be a good question for Sonia, but to our knowledge in Hudson Bay in particular, there hasn't been a strong effect from orca coming into the bay. There's only been 9 known sightings of orca coming into the bay, but to some dramatic effect. beluga definitely know when there are orca in, and it's we haven't witnessed this ourselves, but other guides that we work with have described it as the beluga literally trying to crawl onto land to get out of the way of the orca. Again, Bella said the population is about 75,000 strong in the Hudson Bay as a whole. Around the lodge that we operate out of Seal, there's around 10,000 in that local geographic area, and the population is doing quite well. The numbers are increasing. Again, it's kind of very easy species to count and study. You can do some aerial surveys to do some population research on them. So no effect on the population as of yet, or no noticeable effect. The belugas are doing quite well in the Hudson Bay region, and their numbers are increasing year to year.
Okay, lots of questions. This is awesome. So we have another question from Barbara. Are you seeing evidence of the hybridization between polar and grizzly bears? So really great question. And yeah, we have seen that. I should say we personally haven't seen a hybridized bear. We would love to. That is happening in the Arctic, and we expect, and scientists expect that that's going to happen more and more as the polar bears, go farther south and the grizzlies go farther north. They're of course going to cross paths. But what we have noticed along the Hudson Bay coast, specifically talking about grizzlies, is a huge increase in the grizzlies coming out to the coastline. And they really wreak havoc on people's cabins. So a lot of the locals have cabins along the coast that they will use to hunt during the winter months. And believe it or not, grizzlies are a lot more destructive than polar bears are. So we've seen and we've heard lots of accounts of grizzlies completely destroying cabins. They'll try their hardest and they're very persistent to get into a cabin. Of course, people board them up really well with what we call welcome mats, which are basically pieces of wood that you nail nails into, so nail boards. And people, they really do board their cabins up well, but grizzlies will persist and they get in and they make, of course, a total mess. Polar bears don't seem to do that. Of course, they're not on land during the winter. So that's one of the reasons.
It's just like kind of nicer. Bella and I spent a lovely 2 days at a cabin on our days off in between two parts of a season a couple years ago, literally shoveling grizzly bear poo off the ground that had broken into a cabin. It was a lovely time. Our next question here, go to David Morris asking about, is Japan observing whaling moratorium now? That's a very interesting question. They are observing the whaling moratorium. However, they are still proceeding with whaling under the guise of scientific research. And so they've set themselves a quota. And admittedly, I remember some news about it changing recently, but essentially they set a quota of 333 individuals that they're allowed to take a season. But who knows what the real numbers of how much catch they are actually doing. Again, that's a weird story of this year. They're likely still proceeding with their scientific research this year, and there's far less activity on the tourist front. Other than whaling, there's also the occasional vessel that we see down along the Antarctic Peninsula that is either proceeding with fishing, Patagonian toothfish, or fishing for krill within protected waters of Antarctica. So yes, Japan is still whaling. There's also some illegal fishing and whaling operations that happen around the world. Really, that one of the ways that we can monitor that is through tourist operations. So, great question. This one.
Okay, so we have a question from Fraser. How do you deal with a polar bear if it decides to come closer to you on the ground with your group? I know you don't want to shoot the bear, so how far are you from secure safety? So that's a really great question, and that's a really detailed answer that we need to give. So we'll try our best to kind of get through it as efficiently as we can. But so to begin with, we work under really tight margins in terms of our guide ratio. So we have 3 guides on the ground at all times to 16 guests. So that's a really high ratio in terms of guests to guides. And then secondly, we have kind of really strict procedures in place. So firstly, we give our guests a quite thorough safety briefing. And secondly, we have the guides will, kind of discuss amongst themselves the excursion. So we usually go on 2 a day, 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon. And 2 of the guides will be in charge of, well, how we say dealing with the bear. So 1 guide will be talking to the bear. So we have a full deterrent system that we go through, and it starts with talking, just as I'm talking to you right now. If we have a bear that's showing behavior where it's coming in close to check us out, we'll start talking. Hey bear, how's it going? Beautiful day to be out for a walk. And we want to see the behavior that's eliciting from that bear. Some bears, that talking is going to turn that bear completely around and send it on its way. Other bears, that might pique its interest. Other bears, they might not care at all, and they're just going to keep doing what they do. So from talking, we have a few other deterrents that we can get to. We often always carry rocks with us. And so kind of like you can think of like navel orange size rocks, and we use those as sound. So a really harsh clicking noise is what those rocks will make. And that sound is really unique to the bears. They live in pretty much a quiet world, so that often gets their attention. And that's what, as guides, that's what we want. We want to get their attention so that we can then basically hold their attention, and we like to kind of think of, we can control them from there. If needed, those rocks can be used as projectiles. So bears have really thick an outer layer of skin, fat essentially, quite thick, 2 to 3, maybe 4 inches thick. So a rock hitting them isn't bad. They're not injured. They're not sore from it. But what it does is it makes that contact. It makes touch. And in the bear world, the only bear to touch another bear is an older bear. And usually that's something that is a negative experience, right? They're going to be encountering a fight or sparring, the photos that we showed you. So the touch is really important. From there, depending on kind of what behavior what we get out of that, we have some kind of what we like to say non-lethal deterrents. So we have bear spray that we can use. Bear spray is very effective. There's actually lots of studies out there saying that bear spray is much more effective than lethal deterrents. So guns, firearms, shotguns is what we use. And then from bear spray, we can go into, we have little pistols that shoot off bear bangers or screamers. So they have, there's some pyrotechnics and some loud noises, and those often kind of get the bear's attention and usually send them on their way. And before I get to our last deterrent, something that we use often early on is the group. So again, we have 16 guests, 3 guides, that's 19 people. That's a pretty big grouping of people to have in front of a bear. So we oftentimes will use the group, and we get the group to practice these movements in the safety of the compound before we go out, either walking towards the bear all at once, or we can make ourselves look really big by spreading out kind of shoulder to shoulder, or we can go in tight if we need to. But then, of course, as you saw in the photos, all of the guides are carrying shotguns at all times. That's our lethal deterrent. That's kind of our last resort. In Churchill Wild's 26 years of operating, they have never shot a bear. And we hope that can continue, of course. Our guides go through really rigorous training. We're only bringing on guides that have lots of experience in the polar region, specifically with polar bears and specifically with firearms. In terms of our distances, in terms of approaching bears, we won't approach a bear closer than 100 meters. And we often like to have landmarks in between us. So if we can have some water in between us, those really kind of help in terms of deterring bears coming into us, but the bears don't know the rules. So if they're interested, they will come, of course, in, and those are the deterrents that we can use to scare them off. So I hope that answers your question.
We had a friend who got us this gig, and he would tell us about clicking rocks together and hitting bears with rocks. And it wasn't until the first time that each of us tried that tactic that wow, this really worked. He thought he was telling us a lie, but you really do see the south end of a northbound bear. From David Morris, when do polar bears give birth? The mothers will go into the den. The ones at the Hudson Bay will make an earthen den, as Bella said, and they'll go into their den sometime in the fall. So around October, they'll start to go inland. These pregnant mothers will go in, and then they'll actually have their cubs quite early and kind of use the den as an external womb. So around late December or early January, they'll have their cubs, and then they'll emerge from the den around late February or early March. And when they're born, they're quite small, like, I don't know, think like smaller than a house cat kind of size, and grow from there quite rapidly. So the couple of cub photos that we had in the slideshow, those were essentially 8-month-old cubs, cubs of the first year, or koi as we call them.
And so female bears, really interestingly, they only have a gestation period of 60 days, which of course is really short, but they use the earthen den basically as an external womb. So they'll have their cubs, as Paul said, in December to January, depending on the year or on the timing, but they'll stay in that den into late February or even later into March. And then of course in the higher Arctic, they'll stay in longer into April.
Yeah, they're one of these species that mating season is in the spring. They're one of these species that has a delayed implantation. So the fertilized egg will just hang out until there's a trigger that happens with the bear and in her hormones, and if she's had enough food, accumulated enough fat stores to proceed with the pregnancy, then something will get triggered, and she will the egg will implant, and she'll go from there. From Lynn, have you ever gone scuba diving in the North or Antarctica? Funnily enough, not scuba diving, but we have done some snorkeling around the Hudson Bay. And we used to do this with guests, in fact, before there were some changes to some regulations about beluga viewing. But essentially, we used to tow people behind a Zodiac. So imagine, a water skiing tow strap looped around somebody's feet, dragging them in a dry suit backwards, so the snorkel end is away from the boat, about 30 feet behind the Zodiac. And we used to get people to hum or sing through their snorkels. And the beluga would find that irresistible. They would think, man, I have to go check this out. And they would swim up and get right up into people's faces. And they're really, really curious. And their vocal range is about the same as ours. And their auditory range is about the same as ours, but quite a bit expanded on either end. But you could hear them chattering away in the water, and they would imitate the songs that people were trying to sing. It was very strange experience. With some changes that were largely targeting the St. Lawrence population of beluga to put in place better protections, made it so that, despite that being, in our opinion, a very low risk activity for the belugas, it meant that we weren't able to offer that as an excursion for guests anymore. But yeah, it felt like we were trolling with humans for beluga. But really, really cool experience.
But yeah, specifically regarding scuba diving, there are quite a number of companies that offer it in Antarctica and a few kind of unique companies that offer it in the north, in the Arctic. We personally haven't worked for a company that offers that option, so we have never done that, but it definitely looks interesting.
Ben and Alex, what's your favorite animal that you've seen? You want to go first?
Polar bear #1, whales #2.
Yeah, I have to admit, polar bear is on the top of my list. I've always been very obsessed with bears, and getting to see them in person. But wolves is probably close to second on my list too. There's my first year working for Churchill Wild, there was a very large pack of wolves that was hanging around the Nanook Lodge, and there were 29 individuals in the pack, and they got very, very comfortable with us being around. And it really started as telling as to how dogs were originally domesticated. They were very easily sensitized to our presence, and by the end of the season, they would barely even get out of our way when we went off on the machines or off on a walk. They just went about their business doing wolf stuff, and that was really cool, I have to admit. How many times have your boat tipped? Again, from Ben and Alex. I hope you're talking about the kayaks. Our ships have never tipped on any of our expedition cruises, although they come pretty close on the Drake Passage. We've been in some 10 to 12 meter seas through there. I don't know. Every couple of kayaking expeditions. So every couple of voyages, you'll get one or two people that decide to try swimming. But we have people in dry suits, so it's a kind of a non-event if somebody does end up flipping. We stuff them back in their boats and change out their gloves, and the warmest thing to do is just to keep paddling. We don't want them to miss out on anything, and they're in a dry suit, so they're completely dry on the inside. And but maybe a half dozen, six different people I've had flip their kayaks along the way. A lot more.
Had one.
Bella's only had one. She's a much better guide than me, but I've had a lot of people fall off stand-up paddleboards though, and lots.
But in terms of canoes in the on the northern rivers, quite a few canoes tip on those rivers. We personally try not to dump with our guests because we are the rescue boat, so it looks pretty bad if we dump, but it certainly has happened. But yeah, there's lots of swimming in with whitewater canoeing for sure. Have any of the kayak expeditions had a kayak dumped by a whale coming up underneath? That's from, I can't see the name, Marsha C. That's a good question. We have never had that experience, but certainly I've seen videos online of people in kayaks with whales coming up underneath. That really shouldn't happen, just in terms of the regulations that are in place down in the Antarctic. That really shouldn't be an issue. And the really amazing thing about these creatures is they're so spatially aware. You'll be out in your kayak and you'll think there's a massive pod of humpback whales coming directly for me, but they know exactly where you are. They know exactly where they are and how to maneuver their bodies, and they'll go right around you, being careful even with their flukes to not touch you at all. So they're incredible animals. So that really shouldn't happen. I think, those videos that we see online, that's probably just mismanagement of people, really.
Yeah, there's many times we've been an inch away from humpback whale. The big ones that can be up to 28 meters long. They're very large animals, much larger than the kayaks, and they know exactly how. I don't know if they can sense it or what, but they know that maybe we're a little bit on edge, and they're very, very careful, and you can see it in their eyes. That they're being careful and cautious around us for our benefit. It's just kind of incredible. From Brian, which Arctic river is your favorite and why? You want to go?
You go. I think we have the same one.
Yeah, I think it's the same for both of us. We love the Mountain River. It's a really amazing place. It's a river that flows out of the Mackenzie Mountains into the Northwest Territories. So the Mackenzie Mountains forms that divide between the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. And you can kind of imagine it being about halfway up. And it flows into the Mackenzie River just around Norman Wells. It's a stunning, stunning river. You start in this, I think part of the thing that we love so much is that it starts in a tiny little lake and literally it's a trickle that comes out of it. So you're seeing that river build from the headwaters to the Mackenzie, and the changes that you see. It's got great hiking, amazing geological formations along the way, and just amazing, stunning scenery.
And there are many rivers that we still want to paddle that we have yet to do. So there are many on the list.
Oh, from M. Scriver, there's a comment here saying, seems like orca are called Arluk in Inuktitut. So there you go. They do have a name. Is that Barbara back?
Yeah, Barbara was asking.
Has the seal population changed at all in Churchill/York factory areas? Yes, it has. And one of the stories that's happening up in the area is that there's actually, let's call them an invasive species. The harbor seal is starting to become the most numerous seal in Hudson Bay, and sort of rapidly outcompeting some of the other seals in the area. But we get bearded seals, harp seals, yeah, I think that's it. Harbor seals, harp, for the most part, most of those populations are doing fairly well, but that will be something to monitor as the extent of the sea ice decreases. The ice is really the platform for all life in the Arctic. It's where the primary production happens for the most part. During the summer, the bay is kind of a bit of a wasteland, but it's really the freshwater rivers that provide the influx of nutrients. Yeah, as the seal populations change, for the time being, they're all doing quite well. But the estimate is that the harbor seals will start to be the most dominant species in the area. And that we'll see a decline in the rest of the seal populations. That's heavy caveat there. That's some definite guide formation. If you don't know the real answer, you just say something with confidence, and people will trust you. So you might want to fact check me on that one, but that is what I have said in the past, and I'm pretty sure that is correct.
So from Jim, a really great question. Do you know the fat content of polar bear milk? So great question.
Like 35%.
So when the mothers first give birth in the den, of course, their only food source is the breast milk from the female. So it's high, 35%. But of course, it changes as those bears get out. So they're born, they come out of the den in February, March, and they're hightailing it onto the ice because land is a really dangerous place for them. Wolves specifically are going up and down the coast waiting for these cute little cubs with their mums. They're waiting to feed on them. So they're trying to get out onto the ice as fast as they can. As soon as the bears get onto the ice, school's in for the cubs. Mom is hunting. She's doing her best because she's starving. She hasn't eaten anything since last June. Maybe she's had some seaweed, some berries during the summer, but she hasn't eaten in a long time. She's starving. She's been feeding cubs. So school's in for the cubs. As the cubs learn and begin to eat a lot more, of course, that fat content will decrease. But the cubs will stay with the mom till they're about 18 months. And then typically they'll get pushed off the following year. So they'll get pushed off by males wanting to mate with their mother. So that's oftentimes how they get pushed off. And the interesting thing about polar bears is they're so slow to reproduce because at one given time, only 1/3 of the female population is actually available for mating, because the 1/3 has young cubs, and 1/3 is, has the second year cubs. So it's a really slow population to reproduce.
Mm-hmm. And the last little tidbit there is that all throughout those sort of roughly speaking 18 months to 2 years that the cubs will stay with their mother, they'll continue to nurse all the way along. And towards the end of the time with the cubs, it becomes more of a bonding and thing than a real food source. The fat content essentially drops to zero. Yeah, it's they will continue to nurse for almost 2 years.
And we have a question from Jan about our contact info, and Jan will send you a message directly with our contact info. But it looks like those are all of the questions. Oh, we have one. One more that just came in.
What type of interaction, if any, do you have with local human populations? Yeah, like, so for each of the sorts of guiding, when we would do canoe tripping, it largely depended on the river and the region that we were traveling out of. Our trips that happened on the Nahanni River in the Nahanni National Park, there's really great access to the local communities and park staff. There at Virginia Falls, there were interpreters that would be there, and park staff. They would share great local knowledge. There would be normally there would be at least one, if not all the park staff would be local Dene or the Decho First Nation. So we would get access to being involved with the communities as guides. In between our trips, it was we definitely had the chance to be involved in the community and help out during our days off and visit with locals that we came to know, and largely all surrounding the pilots and their sort of community of friends. But that was one of the most fun parts, was having those days off and going and relaxing, and those little communities really get under your skin. In the Arctic and Antarctica, we would have some pretty strong opportunities to connect with the locals on these expedition cruise ships. We would have community visits where we'd talk to the local hamlet beforehand and be able to organize the cultural displays, or just time to visit with locals, and peruse the local artists' wares. And many of the Arctic communities, especially in Greenland and the Canadian Arctic, have some incredible art that I'm sure many of you are aware of. But it's really great to be able to go in and have a chat with some of the local artists and see what they have for sale, see what they've been working on.
And then in and around Churchill, of course, so the owners of the lodge are Churchillians themselves, but we also do have a number of guides who are local First Nations. We have one man, Albert Saunders, who was actually born at York Factory before they were relocated to York Landing, and he spent his entire life trapping along the coast right around Nanook there. So he comes to the lodge often. He started out guiding there when the lodge first opened back in the 70s. And he's, of course, an amazing resource to have. And we learned so much from him. He kind of does a Cree word every day, so the guests get to learn a lot from him as well. And those relationships are really special for sure.
And then I guess lastly, in Antarctica, there are really locals, but there is the opportunity to visit some of the scientific research stations. And oftentimes we'd be involved with shuttling people, the base staff, to and from their stations that we could go and visit. And so it'd be fun to go and interact with them. And there's one particular station called Vernansky. It's a Ukrainian base, and the good thing to do there is that they got a whole delivery of lumber a number of years ago, and they were supposed to make a shed or something for snowmobiles. or something like that. But instead they made a fabulous bar. And they brew their own vodka. So the thing to do there is we bring a bottle from the ship and trade it for their locally Antarctic made vodka. But I think that kind of brings us to the end of the questions. Just scrolling through the chat as well. I think we managed to get everything here. So again, thanks so much for your time. And yeah, happy that we were able to share some of our experiences with you.
There I am. Well, thank you to the two of you. It has been a fantastic presentation. And Bella, I think your parents should be so proud of you. And I actually think maybe you surpassed them. So they're going to have to step up their game. It's been a wonderful, wonderful presentation. And it makes me a little nervous because I have one next month. So I don't have near the knowledge that you do on where I was, but I did have a lot of pictures to show, but you guys have just been fantastic. And I'm sure everyone has absolutely loved it. So well done, you.
Oh, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. So I think that concludes everything as far as I'm concerned, and we can sign off. Great presentation. And everyone can look forward to the one on January the 28th. And we'll hopefully see you soon. It's been wonderful.